Bienvenue dans cet épisode consacré à la fragilité croissante des démocraties en Europe et aux États-Unis. Autour de la table, 4 experts analysent la montée du populisme, la défiance envers les institutions et l'érosion des normes démocratiques. Un échange transatlantique en anglais pour éclairer les causes de cette déconsolidation et les pistes pour y faire face.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frédéric Gontier. I'm professor of political science at Sciences Po Grenoble, also affiliated to the PACT Research Center, and I will chair this roundtable together with Angela Tassea and Céline Belot. It's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. We are delighted to bring together 4 leading experts to delve into one of the most pressing issues of our time, is democracy unraveling in the West. Before giving the floor to Angela, who's going to introduce the speakers, I would like to say that this event is organized as part of 2 research projects. The first one is TrueDem, which is an Horizon 2020 project involving scholars from 12 countries, and we examine the erosion of political trust and its implications for democracy. The second project is Demosis, short for democracy, citizenship, and institutions facing the transformations of public sphere. Demosis is a nationally funded initiative led by a consortium of 7 French universities, and the project has just started. Sciences Po Grenoble will contribute through the Democracy Barometer, which is an innovative tool to track and analyze citizens' democratic aspirations over the next 7 years. So today's roundtable aligns seamlessly with the goals of both projects, drawing on insights from both Europe and the United States. We seek to unpack the forces driving democratic deconsolidation and to better understand the shared and unique challenges each context presents. Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frédéric. So I will present you our 4 distinguished speakers in the order of their speaking. So I will start with Nona Meyer, who's CNRS Research Director Emerita at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics in Sciences Po Paris. Her research focuses, among others, on the electoral dynamics of the National Rally and the populist radical right in Europe. Second, we have Natasha Wunz, who's professor of European Studies as well as co-director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Freiburg. She studies processes of democratic promotion and democratic regression, primarily in post-communist space, and their implication for the European integration. Third, Professor Edward Freeland is Executive Director at the Princeton University Survey Research Center, and his research focuses on trust in democratic governance. And last but not least, Adam Berinsky is Professor of Political Science at MIT. He's particularly specialized in political rumors and issues of disinformation, on which he has recently published a book, and I think he will talk more about his book in his presentation.
Thanks. So we have organized this conference in 3 parts. So first, we will propose a general overview on democratic deconsolidation, starting with the situation in France, then enlarging to the European Union situation with a focus on Poland and Hungary. And finally, comparing with the situation in the United States. So in this first part, we propose each speaker to have 15 minutes maximum, so we'll be the guardian of the time. Sorry for that. Then in a second phase, we're going to propose to our 4 speakers to come back and focus on more specific questions which we believe need to be examined truthfully, such as the role of institutional setups in making countries more or less resilient or prone to democratic backsliding, the partisan bias in support for anti-democratic norms, and the role of misinformations, the force behind them, and the institutional safeguards. And so we'll finally end up by opening the discussion with the audience. We hope to leave enough time for that. And so please do take the floor will be yours at some point. So do not hesitate to ask any question you want. So we'll have till 2, and I give you now the floor, Nona. Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Okay. So thank you for inviting me to this conference on a more than ever topical issue. So I'll try to focus on a book we are finishing, coordinated with Frédéric Gontier, Elodie Druez, Vincent Tibéry, Félix von Nostitz, and Camille Kelbel. And it's exactly on that theme. It's French democracy and distress. Actually, it started by a very modest project analyzing the elections of 2022. They were very interesting elections because Macron won, but very short, no majority in the parliament, because it was a record level of votes for the far right, Marine Le Pen, and because the mainstream parties of the left and of the right were down to a ridiculous level of 6.5% of the votes if you add the scores of the Socialists and of Les Républicains. So very quickly, it turned into something more ambitious about an analysis, a thorough analysis of what's going on with French democracy. And there we started reading and trying to position the book in the debate that was started, especially the debate started by Foa and Munch about democratic deconsolidation in the old settled democracies and the fantastic criticism that it triggered. And that's where we came in. So for us, the idea was to take France as a magnifying lens. France seemed a very good case to analyze democratic deconsolidation because it has a maximum level of distrust, and I'll see if I can show you the slides there. If the slides were on, it would be better. So this is a very nice. Will you take the mic? Hmm? Or I can take the mic, one or the other. No, but I can stay there because I know what there is on my slides. So there, it's a survey that was done in 8 European countries in last September, and it shows the level of criticism, the feeling that democracy doesn't function well, and you see that France is among those with the highest level of rejection. And I'll go to the next, yes, the next slide if it works, because it didn't work. Yeah, okay. And there it shows that France is even more convinced that things have been getting worse in the last 5 years. So you see that the level of discontent is much higher than in the United States, for instance. There are many other indicators that made us choose France. The negativity towards political parties. Today, something like 59% of the population, when you ask the question in the American way, doesn't feel close to any political party, and 14% has no trust in political parties. There was also a massive level of protest against the reform of the pensions, and before, of course, the yellow vests. There is a rising level of abstention, not always, depends on the election, but there was in the 2022 legislative elections, and there was a record scores of the far right, with Marine Le Pen and her party in 2022 getting more than 41% of the votes in the second round, 13.5 million voters. So all that showed that France was a nice case to study. And the idea we are trying to defend in the book is the argument is that democracy people are not content with the way it functions, but they want more democracy. They don't want less democracy. And I'll go inside a little later, but we are taking a bit from what Larry Bartel's book, which is Democracy Erodes from the Top. The idea that we would not be looking at democracy only at the bottom, at the attitudes of the citizens, but the things really important was to see what was going on at the top, with the idea that the political elites were more and more insulated from the base, from the citizens, and that they were themselves not respecting the rules, and that they were deaf to what the citizens had to say. So that's the line we followed in that book. So I won't sum up the book, and it's almost finished, but I'll rather focus on the 2 chapters in which I took part. One with Daphne Alikiopoulou about the consequences of social exclusion and social precariousness, and the other one with Elodie Druez and Michael Durand about the intergenerational change, value change, intergenerational value change, going against the backlash theory of Engelhardt and Norris. So first, what about precariousness? That's in the line of the work of a French sociologist called Robert Castel, who described the return of social insecurity after the end of the growth in the mid-70s. And of course, it has been getting worse with the Great Recession, COVID, etc. And the idea was that it's not only material poverty, it's not only a question of income. And I use an indicator which the people of Grenoble know very well, which is called the score épices, like spices, but it has nothing to do with the spices of the Middle East. It's an indicator in 11 questions, very simple, that measure, do you live alone or in a couple? Do you own your house or not? Have you gone on holidays for the last year? Have you gone to a movie, to a show? Is there anybody can put you up in case of problem, or somebody you can borrow money from? And it gives you a superb indicator of precariousness, social precariousness. By convention, it goes from 0, not at all, to 100 maximum. At 30, you consider that the person is precarious. And in our last electoral survey, Young Elect, in 2022, 29% of the sample had at least that score. And it's very important because young people, women, people who are immigrant-born, single families, single-parent families, the level is 2 or 3 times more higher. So that's what I was interested in. And if I have now, because I got confused, how many minutes do I have left? 6? Oh, so that's perfect. So I'll calm down. So then the 2 consequences of having a high score on that indicator of social precariousness, the first one is to mute the person. Silent voices, I like the book of Adam. And it depends on the election, but if you just cut your sample in 5 by increasing level of precariousness in the upper quintile, in some of these elections, over 50% didn't express a choice, didn't go, didn't vote, didn't say for whom they had a preference. And it goes for below 10% among the least precarious. So the first thing is to take away large portions of the electorate from the polls. And if I find my other slide, this one, there, it just shows you the different levels of implication by rising level of precariousness from Q1, not at all, to Q5, the most precarious. And these people, you can see on all the indicators, if you get the higher, the most precarious you are, the less interested you are in politics, the less often you go to the polls, the more often you are a constant abstentionist, and the less often you vote. So that's the first result. The second result is when you do vote, when you are precarious, well, there's no specific rule. In 2012, we already started with that indicator. The more precarious you were, the more you voted for the left, for Hollande. And then after 5 years of Hollande, the more you were precarious, the least you voted for the left, the more you voted for Marine Le Pen. And that, I don't know if I have it on. No. Yeah. It's the votes in the two elections, first round, second round of the 2022 elections. And the more precarious you were, the more you voted for Marine Le Pen, and the less precarious you were, the more you voted for Emmanuel Macron. And so it's a very clear-cut result, but a result in the last 2024 elections. There's a work done not with surveys, but with aggregate data at the level of the stations, polling stations. And it seems that this time, people who are in the poorest polling stations are voting more for the left. So that means that it can change, that it means that there are possibilities for the left to win over some of these voters. It's not as simple as one could say. Now, the second paper I would like to dwell on a little is about intergenerational value change. There we go against the theory of the cultural backlash. There is indeed a rising level of cultural liberalism in France, like in most democracies. But there's no polarization. All the generations follow the same pattern. They're all going up. And besides, when you look at votes, it's not the young voters, sorry, it's not the old voters, as assumed by Pippa Norris and Ronald Engelhardt, that vote the most. It's the younger voters. So we have a nice puzzle to explain. Why is France, like many other old democracies, more and more culturally liberal? And why is there a rising level of support? And that among the young. So of course, there are many reasons. I'd like to show you just a very nice graph by Vincent Tiberi. And it shows an index of tolerance. It's the annual survey on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia by the National Commission, Consultative Commission for Human Rights. And it's a synthetic indicator with 75 indicators. So it shows a mood. And the mood is towards more tolerance. Even though after October 7, there was a slight fall, it remains at a very high level compared to what you could see in the 90s. So there is indeed a level of a rising level of tolerance. There are ups and downs according to the way the political class frames incidents. When there's the football cup, there's a woof, tolerance, fraternity. And when there is the discourse of Nicolas Sarkozy in Grenoble against foreigners, it goes down again. And to our surprise, after Charlie Hebdo, we thought it would go down. No, it went up because Charlie Hebdo at the time was framed as we are all threatened together by the same Islamist threats. And the other thing which is very nice, it's always Vincent Tiberi, beautiful curves. They look like spaghettis, but that's the way he likes them. There you see that every generation works, every cohort, birth cohort, they evolve in the same directions. But every new cohort is more tolerant than the cohorts that came before. And among the very younger ones, it's not going down. And these are central values in a democracy, tolerance to minorities. The other thing I wanted to say, so why do you explain that at the same time, votes, 3 minutes, okay, votes for Le Pen are going up? First, because young people, even educated, even bac plus 2 in France, they go less and less to the polls. They vote intermittently. They find other ways to express themselves politically. 2, they are diverse. And education interacts, of course, with age. The younger generations, educated, are the most tolerant. The younger generations who have not the baccalaureate, who have bad diploma, they are the most prone to vote for Marine Le Pen. So there's no surprise there. It's not the same young who are tolerant and who vote for Le Pen. And the last thing important, and Vincent Tiberi has showed it very clearly in his last books about the myth of the droitisation, the turn to the left of French society, there's a growing gap between French society at large and the people who are registered and go to the polls, and the political class. They are indeed turning to the right, but they are more and more away from what the people are. So that's the challenge. How do you close that gap? But, and if you want, I can stop there. If not, I had one more sentence, if I find it in the beautiful mess of my papers. It should be there somewhere, yes. The challenge would be, yes, the two challenges then for democracy maybe would be bring the poor back in, or the precarious, and bring the young back in, because for the moment they are indeed silent and silenced voices. And I'll stop there. Yeah. Do you need that?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Where would my slides be?
Right, you're right. So we're launching it from the webinar, or trying to. Everything was going too well. Yeah. Et voilà.
So now I'm kind of far away from the mic. Can this stand on a? It's okay? All right. Yeah, so thank you very much from my side also for the invitation. I think my presentation fits quite neatly after Nonna's emphasis on the trends in France and this idea of democracy eroding from the top. I will shed light on the citizen side of this dilemma. Starting out with a bit of a kind of broad brush, what does democracy look like in Europe today? We speak about democratic deconsolidation as a global trend. We do see within Europe, it's largely a geographic trend, right? So you really start out with the consolidated liberal democracies, seemingly at least institutionally speaking in Western Europe. And then as we move east, democracies become more deconsolidated. And eventually in red, you have the wise choice. You have the electoral autocracies. And my book will, the book project that this presentation draws on focuses primarily on two of these countries, which is here Poland that you see in the kind of the lighter blue. So Poland went into deconsolidation and then walked back again through electoral means. And then Hungary, kind of the one EU member state with Austria pending, that is actually considered a full-fledged electoral autocracy and no longer fulfills the criteria for a liberal democracy. Now, what is puzzling in this sense, if we say that ultimately citizens are broadly in favor of democracy, and this is something that we see in kind of these large cross national surveys, why do they then not just vote for authoritarian-leaning elites in the first place, but also continue voting for them, or as we just saw in the US, renew their confidence in these great leaders a second time around. And there are kind of three big explanations in the literature. The most prominent one, certainly, and also one that is strongly inspired by the US, is this notion of partisan polarization. So yes, citizens realize that maybe not everything Donald Trump is doing, Viktor Orban is doing, etc., is great, but they have such a strong partisan loyalty, partisan allegiance, that they will always discount democratic transgressions by their co-partisans. Compelling explanation, I think, works in a number of cases. The second one is a more transactional, instrumental one focused on trade-offs. So again, citizens recognize that something is aloof with a democracy, but will trade off the respect of a political candidate for democracy against either economic benefits, welfare payments, and so on, something we see quite prominently, especially in the post-communist settings, or alternatively cultural polarization. And the third, okay. So the third explanation, I'll just keep talking because I know what I'm going to say. The third explanation focuses on divergent understandings of democracy. And I say this is something that is not particularly well recognized in the literature so far, because we have this assumption that citizens do recognize but trade off. And I say actually the understanding of democracy among citizens is much more heterogeneous than we think, and also much more heterogeneous than we are able to measure with these cross-national surveys that ask these big questions. Are you in favor of democracy? Is it important for you to live in a democracy? Who's going to say no in the absence of trade-offs, right? So everybody knows that the socially acceptable answer is yes, and highly so. And so I say we actually need a more sophisticated measure to really capture what is going on in terms of deconsolidation. So now it's no longer presentation mode, or is that the trick you managed to figure out? Because now is it good? Let's see. So now is it working? Okay. So you won't have the nice hearing effect. Never mind. So there are three steps to the argument. How do these divergent understandings of democracy shape citizens' preferences? The first is on the demand side. I say there are these heterogeneous understandings of democracy that we don't capture with established survey measures. And so citizens have a much more complex, much more diversified understanding than we typically estimate them to have. Then, of course, there is a supply side, because yes, democracy does erode from the top, and ultimately elites are the main actors driving these processes. And here I argue that authoritarian-leaning elites actually actively seek to reshape, to reframe citizens' understandings of democracy in order to, in a sense, mislead them by saying, well, it might look like we're violating democracy, but it's actually not the case at all. It's because your understanding of democracy is somehow skewed. And then in the third step, I bring together this supply and demand with an experimental setup, and I look into whether the heterogeneous understandings that I measure on the demand side actually lead to different outcomes when we confront citizens with competing candidates that hold different understandings of democracy or express these different understandings. So I'll walk you through this empirically, but not without saying, so this is kind of my argument, saying these broad brush surveys. Here we have the ESS, the European Social Survey, that does have a pretty sophisticated battery on liberal democratic items. But what you see here, both for the 2012 wave and also for 2020, it's actually surprisingly homogeneous, the level of support for these liberal democratic items. Because again, if you ask a European citizen socialized in Europe, schooled in Europe, do you think independent courts are good? Do you think free media are good? They're not going to say no in the absence of a direct trade-off situation. So we have these very high levels. We see Hungary, Poland, it's constant. It's more or less at the same level as countries like Spain, Lithuania, France, and so on. So I say we don't really capture much with these questions. And so instead, in a first step, I develop what I call a composite understanding of democracy, or I say, commitment to liberal democracy is not just approving liberal democratic items, but it's also about understanding that other ways of seeing democracy are actually not accurate, or should at least not be prioritized to the same extent. And so I have kind of the liberal items, and some of this actually draws on the World Value Survey items. Some of these items I formulated myself. Liberal items, so this emphasis on civil rights, executive constraints, counter-majoritarian institutions. Redistribution here in a more instrumental sense. So democracy is about delivering outcomes, delivering equality in an economic sense. Majoritarian items, where here the emphasis is on democracy, not simply as majority rule, but this perception that qua the support of the electoral majority, whatever the government does is ultimately going to be democratic because, hey, they were elected by the people. Also something we see a lot of times in these autocratizing countries. And then ultimately an outright, what Welzel and his colleagues would qualify as a misunderstanding of democracy, kind of this authoritarian understanding democracy is about law and order, stability. And again, this is something that we see authoritarian leaning leaders pander to a lot. So I asked respondents these 4 different dimensions side by side, and then I use a method called latent profile analysis that allows me to build different types of democratic understandings. I won't walk you through that, but this is basically the outcome that we see what I qualify as strong liberal Democrats. So those that strongly approve liberal democratic items and rate all 3 alternative dimensions low are actually a very small part of the sample. So they're 12% in Hungary, they're 13% in Poland. That doesn't really correspond to the very high support for liberal democracy that we think we see in these cross-national surveys. Instead, we have other groups. So in Hungary, these are the weak liberals, very high support for liberal items, but also very high support for redistribution. So basically, if you're telling me, I'll give you a housing credit, I'll give you family support, I'll give you childcare support, then maybe the independence of the courts is at least as important and not necessarily something that's going to change my mind. We also have some indifference here in Hungary. We don't have many outright illiberals. So we don't have, these would be groups that actually rate liberal items low and authoritarian items higher. So that's not really the problem. It's not that democratic backsliding is an actual regime preference of citizens, but simply that they have a much more varied understanding than we have. In Poland, it's basically the flip side. So again, few strong liberals, quite a few weak liberals, so that are going to be open for welfare payouts, buyouts, and a lot of indifference. So for them, everything is on a 7-point scale around 4. So at that point, you don't really know what democracy really is. It's not really about liberalism. It's not really about majoritarianism. They're confused. A lot of times, I back this up with some focus group research. They are dissatisfied with democracy, but they don't see any way out really, and often they become apathetic. They don't vote anymore. I'll go a little bit faster now. I look at the supply side, I said. So here you see discourse, anti-pluralist discourse by Hungarian and Polish parties. In Hungary, you see very clearly and also exclusively so the Fidesz, the incumbent backsliding party, massively increases its anti-pluralist discourse. And this has been shown to be a predictor of ultimately also institutional forms of backsliding. So you accompany this discourse and then you have some institutional steps that follow up. Just a couple of snippets from here. So this emphasis on liberal democracy has failed. It hasn't protected public wealth. Hungarians are well aware that the starting point for everything is political stability. And this idea, of course, that Viktor Orban has illiberal democracy, Christian democracy, and Christian liberty actually being about everything that liberals neglect, forget, and despise. So really this social polarization that he's really pandering to. We have the same broad trend, a little bit less stark for peace in Poland, the Law and Order Party. And here also this idea, democracy, as I like that one, the Law and Justice Party is a formation whose philosophy is to improve the lives of ordinary people. This is the true essence of democracy. So never mind executive constraints, it's really about improving living standards. The other side is a chaos, fight, war, no plan for democracy. So really drawing also this picture of the others as a threat to the stability. And the claim that Polish democracy is defective because the opposition is allowing itself to criticize the government, although they don't have the majority. So how dare they, right? They need to wait for the next 4 years. Something echoed in the focus groups that citizens will say, you can't criticize if your party isn't in power. You just need to wait for 4 years. Stunning, but apparently an opinion that some Polish citizens hold. And then ultimately, when we bring these two together, so there are 2 conjoint experiments in the surveys I conducted that have 2 competing political candidates, in one case with partisan affiliation and the other without. They have political views, so democratic attributes, but they also have a cultural orientation and economic policy. So just as a quick overview here, how does this play out when we ask them, which of these 2 candidates would you choose? And in the Hungarian case, you see the democratic items are the 2 at the top. They're the ones that clearly have the biggest effect sizes. Quite a few of the others, the economic one doesn't come out at all, the cultural one a little bit. And then when we break this down by subgroups, by these 5 different understandings of democracy, we see that it is indeed the strong liberals, especially here, this was an item on how should judges be nominated. These are the ones that most strongly approve of candidates that hold liberal positions and most strongly punish candidates that hold non-liberal authoritarian positions on how judges should be nominated. And we really see this decline in the order of relative commitment to liberal democracy. Then come the weak liberals, the ambivalent, the indifferent, and the illiberals. And we really have this kind of this scaling down. When we look by party affiliation, it's not that the Fidesz voters necessarily have are more open to autocracy. Where they're different from the other parties is on the cultural axis. So it's really about protecting culture against new influences and protecting these traditional values that that Orban appeals to a lot. A similar image in Poland here, we also have the top 2 are the democratic items, and then comes the cultural one that also plays quite a role in the economic one. But when we look at different understandings of democracy, again, where they are most divided is in this high approval of candidates that hold liberal views for the strong liberals, and then the opposite for the majoritarian and then the authoritarian ones. And the same thing here also, there was an item about free media. Here we see that actually the understanding of democracy also translates into cultural views, pro or against the restriction of abortion, but less so than for democracy. And we also see here that peace supporters are actually a little bit more open also to candidates with non-liberal views compared to other parties. So to sum it up, non-liberal positions are, as I had expected, punished more strongly by citizens that don't show a strong and exclusive commitment to liberal democratic norms. And the evidence on partisan-based explanations that's so prominent in the US case is actually much weaker in these multi-party systems that we have in Europe, because you do have an alternative, an ideologically proximate alternative, and you don't have these deep partisan identities that we have in bipartisan contexts. So ultimately, what I argue in this book is that political culture does appear to inform political behavior quite heavily in these contexts of democratic backsliding. And that, I think, in these contexts is going to be a very important point to start working on what and how much do citizens understand about democracy, and how can we bolster really their confidence and thereby boost the resilience of democratic systems. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Again, my name is Edward Freeland. I'm the Executive Director of the Survey Research Center at Princeton University. And in my job there, I follow public opinion and elections very closely. One of the things that I do after each election is to look at the minimum number of votes required to change the outcome. As you may know, we have the popular vote in America. That's all 50 states with their votes summed up across the board and ignoring the states. But actually, the Electoral College is what decides the outcome of the election. And that's where we have 50 separate state elections and the math that goes into adding up who won in that case. Contrary to what you might have thought from all of the celebrations going on in the US, the outcome was actually quite close. It was only a margin of 230,000 votes. That's less than 0.2% in 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that would have changed the outcome of the election. That's not as close as what happened in 2016, when it was only the margin of victory was only 78,000 votes. This is out of 150 million votes cast. And then the closest margin in 2020 with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, 43,000 people decided the outcome of the election. It's the results not quite as disheartening as one might think. I'm convinced that if Joe Biden had stepped down sooner prior to the primary season, and if Democrats had a normal primary season where they were able to select the candidate who was going to run as president, I think they would have won. So things are not quite as dismal as they might seem. So 3 points I want to make in my remarks today. First, the incoming administration, for a variety of reasons I'll point out, is riddled with internal contradictions. And that does not bode well for good administration in the years to come. Those contradictions are going to make it very difficult for the new administration to accomplish anything. Secondly, Trump has great entertainment skills as a politician and is very politically savvy, but his skills as a manager are seriously lacking. And third, any effort to downsize or purge the federal bureaucracy will be very difficult because, as the saying goes, vous ne pouvez pas démonter une voiture pendant que vous conduisez. All right, you cannot dismantle a car while you are trying to drive it. All right. Now, the internal contradictions, they're already showing on day one. In the United States, there's a tradition known as the party platform. These are documents that are assembled by the two major parties every 4 years just before the presidential election. The tradition goes back to the mid-1800s. So these are policy statements where the party gets together and tries to explain its core values, its priorities, and its plans for what it wants to accomplish in the next 4 years. These documents can run to 30 or 40,000 words typically. And for the first time since 1936, there was no Republican Party platform 4 years ago in 2020. Why was that? Well, for a populist candidate like Donald Trump, you don't need a platform. I am the platform. All right? That's a logical thing for a populist to say. It reminds me of a Louis XIV when he told the Parliament of Paris, "L'État, c'est moi." All right? Another aspiring monarch. So then in 2024, this most recent election, a short platform was thrown together hastily, but only to draw attention away from Project 2025, which you may know about. At 5,200 words, it's the shortest Republican platform since 1948. So not a lot of coherent ideology or detailed plans in terms of going forward. And that is a perfectly logical outcome, as I said, for a populist candidacy. All right. Trump does not want to limit his autonomy or the ability to change his mind on anything at the last minute. Given that, loyalty as opposed to expertise has become the prime criteria for nomination of cabinet officers and agency directors. Now, what are some of these internal contradictions? Let me give you some examples. The nominee for Health and Human Services Secretary has some very strange and potentially dangerous ideas about children's health, but oddly also some ideas that are good. One of the things that he wants to do is sharply curtail the use of toxic substances that are harmful to children in the food supply and in the general environment. So you have that on one side of the administration. In the previous Trump administration, 8 years ago, the director of the Environmental Protection Agency worked very hard to allow more legal use of these same toxic chemicals, particularly those that generate large corporate profits. Right? And we're likely to see a repeat of this effort in the new administration. Another example, Trump wants immediate expulsion of undocumented immigrants. There are 12 million of these folks in the United States. That's about 1/4 of all immigrants. If that happens, the dairy and meat processing industries will immediately collapse. All right? And food prices will soar. His newfound tech billionaire friends want more immigrants to come to the United States, especially those on H-1B visas. These are special visas created for high-tech workers because they are highly skilled, low-paid workers who work under the threat of having their visas revoked if they complain about low pay and their working conditions. So they're ideal employees in that sense. Another example, the tariffs and trade wars that are at the top of Trump's agenda will likely reduce access to foreign markets for that many businesses depend on in the US. He's very popular in rural areas because he has promised to help farmers in those areas. I drove through rural Pennsylvania about a month before the election, and I was astonished at the visible enthusiasm and the enormous billboards and signs that people had erected on their farm fields and in their front yards. But if this trade war happens and these tariffs are imposed, it will close off access to export markets by starting trade wars with China, Mexico, and Canada. And these are three countries that buy billions of dollars worth of agricultural products every year from US farmers. Also, Trump wants to reduce income taxes while raising taxes through tariffs. According to a group of nonpartisan tax experts, under Trump's proposed plan, 80% of American families will see a net increase in their federal tax burden. This is analogous to shifting from income taxes, a progressive tax, to sales taxes, a regressive tax. So that net increase of around $1,400 per household, and the burden will fall most heavily on low-income and middle-income families. Can you guess the average net savings for the richest 1% of households under this plan? Anybody? $36,000 for the richest 1%, all right? So the plan continues the 50-year effort by Republicans and conservatives to shift the federal tax burden away from the wealthiest Americans and onto working and middle-class Americans. Another example, reducing crime. Trump campaigned on the idea that crime in America is out of control. It is not. But through skillful use of media images, many Americans perceive that crime is worse than ever. Trump's nominee for director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, this is a top police official in the United States, has promised to investigate and criminally charge Trump's political enemies, including many of the people who worked for him during his first presidential administration. That would mean diverting limited law enforcement personnel from ongoing investigations, which will have to be suspended or terminated so they can use their time to harass Trump's political opponents. So it seems to me that if they're going to come through on their promises, all or most of these internal contradictions will need to be worked out. And that cannot happen without strong, disciplined leadership, which leads to my second point. Weak leadership. What are Trump's goals as president? I've mentioned a few, but did I mention that he's going to continue selling Trump-branded merchandise, selling cryptocurrency? He had one day a few weeks ago where he came out and endorsed a new cryptocurrency that his family is marketing, and the family's wealth went up by some $10 billion on paper over a matter of a few days. Now, given the failure of the impeachment process in the previous administration and Trump's newly awarded immunity from criminal prosecution by the Supreme Court this past summer, he will be free to devote time to enriching himself and his family. I hope the work that he needs to do as president won't be too much of a distraction from the business of promoting his family's enterprises. His leadership and management skills. Nearly everyone who worked for him in his previous administration was alarmed by the day-to-day waffling, his inability to handle complex details, his impulsiveness, and his focus on personal grievances. In a moment of exasperation, his own Secretary of State called him a moron. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that Trump is at his worst in terms of leadership during a crisis, and those crises are just going to begin to hit him before long. At a point when he could have rallied Americans, especially his supporters, to take reasonable and simple actions to contain the spread of the virus, he was visibly distressed that the pandemic was distracting attention from his re-election campaign. He is also sidelining one of the most powerful resources available to a president for reshaping the federal bureaucracy. Again, one of his principal goals. His own political party, which, like the Democratic Party, has a deep pool of experienced, talented, and knowledgeable professionals. Instead, he is drawing on his own personal network, people who lack knowledge and expertise and boast about it, And that lack of knowledge and expertise is just astonishing. This, again, is in keeping with this populist antipathy toward elites and experts. They're the problem, not the solution. The congressional hearing for Peter Hegseth, Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, was a national embarrassment, to be quite honest. It should have been obvious to anyone watching those hearings that the nominee is dangerously underprepared for the job. During the last month of the election campaign, we heard the word fascist being used by people who worked closely with him in his previous administration, which is why they're on the bad people list now. Yes, you can call him a fascist, but he's not nearly as focused, driven, or as smart as some of the best-known fascists in history. That said, there will be people in the new administration working diligently to increase the power and autonomy of the office of the president. And we know there are plans afoot to move the country closer to single-party rule of the type we have in Hungary, Russia, China, and Ohio. That's one of the 50 US states. But I'm not convinced this can happen without a competent executive and a resolution of all the internal contradictions I mentioned earlier. In fact, I'm more concerned about the potential harms that might result from just sheer incompetence of the kind that was so characteristic during the previous administration. And finally, what about Trump's plans to purge the deep state? These are people who are embedded in the federal government, who secretly control things from behind the scenes. I believe this is very likely to fail. What Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who will be directing what's called the Department of Government Efficiency, will soon discover is that reforming the federal bureaucracy, or the technocracy, as people call it, is extremely difficult. People who work in these agencies are busy protecting the nation's food supply, protecting the environment, tracking the weather, putting out fires, preventing floods, regulating interstate shipment of radioactive materials. They do important life-saving work every day. You cannot simply shut them down while you figure out how to reorganize them. Their work has to keep going on. Jennifer Palka, who was the U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer under President Obama, has spent years working with people, nonprofit organizations, political groups that have tried to streamline and modernize the federal government. She is quite astonished by the fact that Musk and Ramaswamy are going to learn about all the obstacles that she and her colleagues have struggled against for decades when it came to their efforts to modernize the government. And I'll read from her book, or from a recent essay. Outsiders, and certainly the people on the right, imagine dangerously concentrated power in the executive branch and seek to limit it. The reality is shockingly diffuse power. The bad outcomes they are fighting to prevent, burdensome, overreaching government, are the product of exactly the conditions they help create. Neither the left nor the right has the mental models, nor perhaps the desire, to effectively challenge the status quo of the technocracy. There's a reason that bureaucracy is referred to as an iron cage, all right? The problem is, particularly in the US, is that it's not the concentration of power in a deep state. The problem is maddeningly diffuse power across agencies and programs. The contingencies that they're going to encounter that are going to be encountered by any proposal for agency reforms will be staggering. For any given policy, office, or agency, there are myriad connections to laws, legal precedents, and procedures throughout multiple levels of government, that's federal and state and local governments, that have been built up by Congress and state legislatures over many decades. They are not easily ignored or swept aside. Max Weber, the sociologist, taught us that bureaucracy is a powerful human technology, and reform, the technology that makes large modern organizations, business organizations, and government possible. And reform can only be accomplished through either of two extremes: destruction, which has enormous costs, or ironically, a well-organized, bureaucratic, methodical, and disciplined effort much like the one President Obama pulled together to get passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and also George W. Bush's reorganization of Homeland Security after the September 11th attacks. These efforts in both cases succeeded with a mix of expertise, persistence, salesmanship, and bullying. In other words, politics. For Trump's appointees, the lesson will most likely to be learned is clear. You cannot dismantle a car while you are driving it. It may take them 4 years just to learn how to drive, to understand the agencies that they are working for. This is the lesson that reformers in the Reagan administration learned back in the 1980s. Like Trump, Reagan also campaigned on the populist stereotype of the federal bureaucracy as being bloated, wasteful, and inefficient. After 8 years of diligent effort, there was almost no change in the size of the federal government workforce, 2.8 million people. A big increase in non-federal contract workers. These are people who aren't technically employed, but are paid through contracts, from 3 million to 5 million, and a doubling of the federal deficit. If there are reductions in discretionary federal spending, they will most likely fall on the usual suspects, anti-poverty programs. And two of the largest in the US are Medicaid and SNAP, the food assistance program for poor people. So in sum, Trump has shown that you can win an election narrowly as a populist candidate, but governing as a populist is going to be much more challenging and perhaps dangerous. Thank you.
So that wasn't a very happy story. And I wish I could give you a happier story, but I don't think I can. But I do want to talk about some general trends. I think first starting to talk a little bit about my research and how it fits in with this general theme, but then also offer some observations on what's going on in the US at the moment. So as was mentioned at the beginning, I just had a book published last year. My publisher would like me to probably promote that, called Political Rumors. And it is about the kinds of things that we now think about as misinformation, disinformation, kind of falsehoods that spread through society. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin story about that, how I became interested in that. And to do that, I go back to the summer of 2009. Now, I've been studying political behavior at that time for 15 years. I've seen a lot of crazy things, but even so, there were especially crazy things going on in US politics at that moment. So our now twice President Trump was promoting a series of stories that Barack Obama was not a US citizen, that in fact he was born in Kenya, Indonesia, sort of depending on the story, and that as a result, he wasn't eligible to be president. So essentially trying to undermine the authority of the sitting president through these lies. Now, it should be said Trump did not come up with these stories. These are things that had been circulating it, but he was the vector for that. He was really a spread of the misinformation. Another thing I was very interested in was a bunch of stories surrounding, I just mentioned, the Affordable Care Act. So this was Obamacare, the reform in the healthcare system that took place with the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. Now, the prior summer, a bunch of members of Congress went back to their districts at the end of the summer to have open town hall meetings. And at that point, there were a lot of their constituents who were saying, I've heard that there's going to be death panels in these things, that there's going to be a government-run institution to decide whether or not someone should get health care or not. So essentially, a government-run panel to decide whether or not to kill grandma or let her live. Now, these stories, again, gained a lot of traction. Now, there was no evidence for this, that the provisions that people were talking about were, in fact, about end-of-life decisions, like basically how do you manage the care at the end of life. But this is really spread through that rumor machine. And so I was just fascinated by this, just trying to figure out, sort of what's going on. And I should say that when I started this project, I was telling some of my colleagues about it, and they said, rumors, conspiracy theories, that's not political science, right? Why are you studying that? Well, so I guess I got in a little bit early. And then at that moment, I decided I would write a book. So I'm a political scientist, but I was trained like a social psychologist. And when I want to learn about things, I first run some surveys to kind of understand what are the determinants of these different beliefs, and then run some experiments to try to figure out how can I correct them. And so in the sort of the time here, I'm going to spend more time talking about my largely failed quest to try to correct them rather than my to understand them. Now, but I think one thing is important is that there is a component to these stories that sort of thinking about who believes these false stories. Was Obama not a citizen? Was George Bush involved in 9/11? All these sorts of stories is that there's a political component and there's also a personality component. And so it's sort of what I care most about as a political scientist is this political component. And what I find is that on average, Democrats in my country are more likely to believe these stories about Republicans. Republicans are more likely to believe them about Democrats there. So this is kind of the polarization there, motivated reasoning. And so what I tried to do in my experiments was trying to basically try to leverage this partisanship as a form of correction. Now, when I started, the first thing that I thought of was I thought that this would be a very simple project. So I say, story I tell is that this book that came out at the end of 2023, in 2014, I signed a contract that said I would deliver, I'm sorry, in 2012, I signed a contract saying I would deliver it by 2014. I was only 9 years late, and that's because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to correct these rumors. And so my story, the title of my book is Rumors, Political, Why We Believe Political Misinformation and How We Can Fight It. And I had a lot more success on that first part than the second part. But I think a big part of the problem with going in, thinking about how was the best way to counter misinformation or these rumors was to bring in an authority. And so in the case of the United States, early on thinking, if you just present people with the facts, then they'll correct their misbeliefs. And I think that this was a very naive approach based on a notion that we have these kind of self-reinforcing sources of authority. And so I think here what's really important, and this gets to the larger question, is that what made this problem so difficult, the correcting misinformation, is that there's been a generalized loss of trust in institutions, not just in the US, but abroad. But this notion that you could bring in a referee to say like, oh, you might have heard this story. You might have heard Obama wasn't born in the US. Here's the facts. You should believe me. So a story that I tell is at Princeton, I'm sorry, not Princeton, at MIT. I started my career at Princeton and it has made it salient in my mind. So think about that. But when I was at MIT, I was on a committee that was discussing what should MIT do to counter and to respond to climate change. And on the committee, there was an eminent climate scientist, a member of the National Academy of the Sciences, who said, what I do is I go to these conferences where you have climate deniers, people who say that climate change isn't happening. And I said, look, I'm an MIT scientist. Here is what the truth is. You should listen to me. I said, well, in theory, that's how it should work. But in practice, people say, you're an MIT scientist. I'm not going to listen to you. I don't trust you. And so I think what's really important is to recognize that there is this loss of trust in institutions. And this is true not just in politics, the media, in medicine as well. I've done some work in the US talking to doctors, and I was brought into a conference of these doctors in 2018. The head of the association said, I want you to come and scare the doctors for me so that you've seen what's happened in politics. I think it's coming next in medicine. I want you do that. So I gave a talk, and they said, "Oh, it's very entertaining. I liked your stories. Thank you." And then, but 4 years later, I went back to that same group, and they said, "Oh my God, everything you said has come to be that there is this loss of trust. So what can we do?" And so what I said is essentially there is no magic bullet, that once you have lost that trust in authority, once you don't have a self-reinforcing referee who can come in and say, here are the facts, that it's a much more complicated proposition. So this becomes a battle over who is an authority. And we can see this play out in the United States. Recent changes in Facebook and other tech companies, moving away from having fact checkers, right? So this notion that you could bring in an independent expert to say, this was true, was not, and everyone would accept it. Again, that this is how things should work, but not necessarily how they do work. And so this is a very important thing to think about is in I wouldn't say a post-truth society, but in a society where authority is not automatically accepted, how can we correct this misinformation? And so the thing that I sort of talk about in my book, one strategy is to essentially try to leverage people's self-interests in an effort to get the corrections across. So an example I give is thinking about this is thinking about what is, sort of separating the person who decides, sort of what is supported by evidence or not. So not what is true or false, but what is supported by the evidence. It's great to have fact checkers do that, right? These are the people who are the experts. Similarly, when we think about the implications of climate change for society, we want to have the MIT scientists doing that. But those aren't necessarily the best people to deliver that message. So instead, we want to separate the message from the messenger and think about who is the most effective person to deliver that message. So in the case of the death panels, it wasn't having the American Medical Association or the American Association of Retired Persons, that these were people who had the expertise, who were politically independent and said, these aren't true. That worked, but not very well. What worked better is having Republican politicians, people speaking against their apparent interest. They had a lot more credibility. So I think what's really important, and when I talk to different groups in the US, is thinking about that there's a generalized loss of trust in institutions, but that doesn't mean that we need to abandon these institutions. Instead, we want to think more creatively about how to deliver the message. So thinking also in the medical setting in the US, that if we think about the rollout of the COVID vaccine, that there was a lot of skepticism in certain communities in the US about this. Some was political skepticism, but also some was based on some historical treatment of racial groups in the United States. So in African American communities, the Tuskegee experiments were essentially African Americans were used as test subjects in a syphilis experiment for many years. So in that case, it's understandable that there's a loss of trust. So you don't necessarily want to bring the doctors who say like, oh, trust us, we're all set, right? That instead you want to bring in community leaders, right? People who have a relationship with the community. So again, it's not saying that these are the people who are the best people to determine whether or not something is supported by the evidence or not, but these are the best people to deliver that evidence. Now, similarly, sort of thinking about, in the US, we're having an issue now where kind of this politicization of the vaccines surrounding COVID-19 has spilled over to more general vaccines. So question, Ed mentioned, right, our perhaps soon Secretary of Health and Human Services, who has argued against vaccines against mumps, measles, polio, right, that these are all sort of all up in the air for now. And so thinking about that, what we need to do is not saying to have doctors to say like, oh, trust me, I'm a doctor, I know what's going on, because people can respond like, oh, you're just in the pocket of big pharmaceutical companies, right? You're just saying what they want you to say to sell that. Instead, have people who perhaps, parents who have had children who have suffered from measles, or having polio survivors from the, sort of the early part of mid-century in the United States saying, here's what polio looked like. So again, it's being flexible about the delivery of that message there. So, I tell people, I often speak to different groups, doctors, companies, and I always tell people, I know you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the 3 easy things you need to do to fix the problem of misinformation. I said, I'm not here. I can't do that because I don't have that. And anyone who tells you that they can is a fraud, right? Or I use that term snake oil salesman. I don't know if that translates. But it's basically someone who's promising something that they can't do. Instead, what I say is that we want to think hard about these different solutions, that we want to think, given the constraints that we have, how can we better message around issues of information and misinformation? Right. So the ultimate solution, I think, is to build up trust in institutions, but that's very hard, sort of thinking, that's a long-term prospect. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we need to give up completely. And so by being creative, we can think about different ways to essentially embrace the reality, the new political reality, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, and thinking about how we can craft these strategies that can get us through a time, and at the same time trying to build up these sources of authority. And for that, it really does start, as fellow panelists have said, with the politicians. So if we have politicians who are willing to advance our own interests, to tell mistruths, and basically say, don't believe anyone who tells you I'm lying, that's a really hard problem to tackle. So in the meantime, let's think about different strategies. Thanks.
React to each other as if you want. You're not forced to react if you don't have any kind of reaction, but because you simply talked for the audience and for your colleagues and you didn't have the chance to react, you will probably need some time for reaction, and afterward you will eventually continue with some questions. We start in the order of interventions. So,
okay. Difficult because I have a lot of questions, but I won't. But I'll start the other way around. It's very nice what you say, how to fight against misinformation. But how do you do that when it comes about saying the lies of Donald Trump or of Marine Le Pen? Then who is the person who will be the best person to pass the message? So that would be the question for you. I'd be very interesting to know how you answer Marine Le Pen's or Bardella's lies, as well as Trump. Then, Natasha, it's fascinating what you say, because it goes with what we have discovered, that many questions in the big comparative surveys are abstract and they're not very, very useful to understand what really people think of democracy. But can you tell us more about the focus group, or how you how do you really know what people put behind, or can you tell us more about your experiments? Because I like the idea, and that we'd like to do the same. And it's one of the critics for and Munch were fiercely attacked. And I remember the critic of Engelhardt and Norris, and they were saying, really attachment to democracy, it's not by asking these abstract questions about democracy that'll give you the slightest idea. Asking about the values of a democracy, so they also have their problem, but asking about the attitudes toward minorities, etc., that works better. So you have the idea there. What is the best way to tackle democracy? And last, it's fascinating. You are minimizing the success of Trump. But can you tell us a little more about in the history of the last presidents? How much was the popular margin of Trump in general? I'd like to know in the last elections, because you went very quickly on that, and like to know to what extent we can really minimize his his appeal. And two, can you tell us a little more about the rate of abstention? Because in a way, that's what really always makes a difference, differential abstention. So can you tell us a little more?
I mean, that's an excellent question. So I think that this is thinking about in a partisan frame of mind. So when I did these initial experiments, these were back in 2010, 2011. It was possible to have a Republican politician who had a sort of had the standing to say, this is not true. But there's the same problem that there is with fact checking, which is, if I tell you that something you believe is not true, you can either change your belief about the veracity of that, or you can change your belief about me, right? And so to say like, we should have Republican politicians saying that what Donald Trump says is not true. I think that's the advice I would have given in 2016. But then you think about the case of Liz Cheney, for example, who says it's not. And so people changed their view of her. So I think this kind of, that when I talk about my work, people say like, yes, we want to have partisans countering. And so in my mind, that's not right, that doesn't necessarily work, right? But it doesn't mean that there are no credible sources there. So again, thinking about going to different communities and figuring out who has the credibility. Now, a lot of this also that kind of relates to other talks here, depends on having political elites who behave well, right? And so I think, a lot of what I've learned about Donald Trump in the United States is that a lot of things that I thought were not possible are indeed possible. So in 2016, if you had asked me or any other political scientist that summer, let's say you have a politician who says, I never said this, and then you can roll, tape of them saying it, what would happen to that politician? I would say, well, they would be finished, right? This has happened before. So like Joe Biden ran for president in 1988, was caught in mild plagiarism, had to resign for the race. This is what I thought would happen. In fact, that you saw this is the Access Hollywood tape with Trump, that Republican politicians at first were like, I'm not really sure, that you had the Speaker of the House saying, this is not good, right? And for a couple of days there, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. But then Trump basically said, like, enough of that. I'm just going on, right? And so you have other cases, not just of that, but other communication. And what I think about most is that, that there was a story that Trump had said that, global warming is just a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese government. He said, I didn't say that. And then you wrote it. It's like, he said it. And, I just thought that would be done. And so a lot of the things that we thought were rules and norms of politics tend to be very ephemeral and based on politicians behaving well. And so what I would say, sort of the depressing part is saying like, yeah, this thing that works isn't going to work right now. But the hopeful thing is thinking that there might be other strategies. So I don't know who those spokespeople are, but it's about thinking about being creative. And so, but the thing is like, even if we're not thinking about Donald Trump per se, we can think about the policies that are associated with him. So thinking about questions on immigration. What's interesting is that, sort of the tech bros that are involved with the Trump campaigns, like Elon Musk, actually, there's a lot of support of immigration policy there, right? And so kind of thinking, are there ways that things could be perhaps pushed back in different ways? So again, it's not an easy solution, right? I'm not a snake oil salesman. I'm not here to say I know how to solve it, but I think that we just really need to be creative.
Hey, thanks, Lana. So I think there's basically two sides to how to resolve the lack of knowledge we have on what citizens think about democracy. And I think the first is, if we want to continue having this cross-national temporal sense, I do think we can work with improving the survey instruments we have by essentially, my point is expanding the batteries, and not in terms of depth, because I think that's where we've gone, but we've reached the limits, but in terms of breadth. So if all you're asking citizens is, do you agree with everything that I as a researcher think democracy is about? you're not getting very far. So I think you need to get at, through qualitative work, what else thinking about, and then formulate that as a survey item and ask them, so do you think the majority should always overrule the minority? Do you think minority rights should always take effect? And they will say yes, or at least part of my sample said yes. But the thing is, we don't give them that possibility in these surveys to make those points. So I do think, and I've had that discussion with Pippa Norris, who was like, well, we want to expand the battery, but I don't see what you mean with majoritarianism. I'm like, so I'm going to send her a book. I'm like, this is what I mean. Please include it now. Because I do think that there is, of course, value in having these big scale surveys. But I also found it extremely fascinating to have these focus groups as a corrective, right? To say, so bar any survey or researcher imposed category, my first question was literally, what does democracy mean to you? And surprisingly, many people were in the abstract able to say, democracy is about civil rights, about everyone being equal, about having independent institutions. And I thought, oh, so, where are we going wrong then? So the second question was about democratic practice. To what extent does democracy in your country live up to what you think democracy should be? And there again, they were able to pinpoint quite well what was going wrong, both in Hungary and Poland. But you would have a bit of an ideological divide on, so either if you're with the opposition, then you think, PiS and Fidesz is dismantling democracy. They see it, they recognize it, they're upset about it. But their conclusion is apathy, withdrawal. Or if you're with the government, you say they're doing that and it's true, but the others would do the same if they were in power. So ultimately, I prefer my guy in power give me welfare benefits than the other guy who's going to give the other people welfare benefits. And then the third question, and that I thought was, our set of questions was most interesting, is to ask them, what do you see as the role of a leader in a democracy? And what do you see as the role of citizens? And that was actually disillusioning to a large extent, in the sense that leaders deliver outcomes. Fair enough, but deliver outcomes, preferably bar any constraints. So I even had an explicit question on, do you think leadership needs to be limited in democracy? Oh no, but then they can't deliver outcomes. They're like, so what I mean is like institutional consent. Yeah, no, they shouldn't be limited. That was kind of broadly consensual view. And then the role of citizens was extremely apathetic. Citizens vote every 4 years. Citizens pay taxes and work. And if citizens don't work and don't participate in the common economic good, then they shouldn't have any political rights. That was also relatively prominent in a post-communist setting, right? Where like, there was a different view at one point. And this idea that even if I'm against, I see what's happening and I'm against what's happening, I can't do anything. I had a question on protest. Do you think what do you think about protests against elected leaders? Oh, you can't protest against an elected leader. They were elected. You need to wait until the next election. And especially when it was like based in France at the time, I'm like, really? Because there are people that would disagree. So that was, yeah, I think these complementary insights work well.
Thank you.
Yes, on the question of the popular vote. So Trump's margin in November was just 2.3 million out of about 150 million votes cast. That's actually less than the margin for Hillary Clinton in 2016. She had 3 million more popular votes, but still lost the election because of the Electoral College math. And then Joe Biden, despite having a very, very close victory in terms of the Electoral College, again, just 42,000 votes, had a surplus of 7 million votes over Donald Trump. All right. So that's how the two different systems, the popular vote and the electoral vote, can work in different ways. So again, with Trump, I would not call this a mandate for his agenda. On the question of voter participation, it's fairly steady and peaks every 4 years in presidential elections at around 60%. So you have 40% of people who don't vote, don't participate. I don't know if it's the same 40%. It probably changes over time. It's primarily younger people and then people who are less attached to society and the labor market. So.
Thank you. Then minority groups?
That I don't know. I know that Black and white voter participation is about the same rate. It didn't used to be that way, of course. So, Blacks were excluded and not allowed to register for many years. but that has pretty much evened out. There are also states that have very large numbers of people who have had their right to vote taken away because of felony convictions. And even when they finish their sentences, their right to vote is not restored. In Florida, there was a referendum, the state of Florida, that directed the state to restore those voting rights to felons who had finished serving their convictions. The state then turned around after the referendum and said, fine, we'll give it back to you as long as you pay all your court costs. And these ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. And then you can have your rights back. So they effectively thwarted a popular referendum directing them to give the right to vote to everyone in the state. So just astonishing. So Georgia, Texas, and Florida, if those folks were allowed to vote, the politics of those states would be quite different. That's how significant those numbers are.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a couple. I thought it was a very nicely complementary interventions. So I'll start in the order. Nona, I think this point on the silenced voices, and basically that's what you're echoing here, 40%. I think that's actually a real danger for democracy, not just, which is bad enough that they're excluded, but because by virtue of being excluded by the current offer, they can also be mobilized by others, right? And I think this is very much something we've seen in Germany with the AfD, who is voting for the AfD, voters that never voted before, and suddenly have a party there saying, hey, we have some easy solutions to offer, vote for us. And once that share of the electorate is 40%, that's a huge kind of potentially determining part. And so I was wondering, do you have any ideas how to bring these silenced voters back in to prevent them from being mobilized by the wrong actors and the wrong parties, which apparently is already starting, right? Then going in a similar direction, Ed, I think you were speaking about these likely cuts that we'll see with the new administration and ultimately this policy very much for the super wealthy. And yet, of course, in a democracy, the super wealthy aren't enough to be elected, right? They're just these few very rich people.
Well,
but
they
again,
got great seats at the inauguration.
They do, they do, and they of course then again need to work with the broad masses. And there I wonder, why is it, or how would you explain why then the vast majority of voters apparently is voting against their interests? And in terms of campaigning for, more specifically in the context of the US, the Democrats, do you think it's more promising for them going forward to campaign on policies or on democracy? Because I think that's a big strategic question in these countries where democracy is very much at stake. Do you want to make that the determining electoral issue? Or do you want to depoliticize and say, look, we are going to offer, better welfare payments and so on? And then last, Adam, you were saying you basically told the doctors what was coming up for them. And I'm wondering, do you think the US is foreshadowing what is going to happen in Europe in the next years? And if so, how can we avoid getting sinking quite as deeply into the mud as the US democracy has now come?
Sure, okay. Thank you for the questions. There are several ways to make them answer. We did work in day centers for the precarious, and we talked with them. And the first idea was they wanted respect, dignity. They said, nobody ever comes to us, we count for nothing. So the first idea was that, and they had ideas politically. Some of them told me, look, send me a candidate and I'll show her or him and what happens in the day of everyday life. And they had concrete solutions. So that would be the first thing. Talk to them, go to them. The second thing would be change the social policies. Macron has managed to restrict even more some of the access to some of the social aids, and the dematerialization of the administrations is terrible because it's more and more difficult for people who are not fluent with the computers to get the rights, the aids to which they are entitled. There's a progression of the people who don't ask for their social aids because it's so complicated. So reintegrating them socially would be a way. And last, there's a problem of political supply. I mean, Hollande, when we did the interviews, the idea was, he's not fantastic, Hollande, but The left, it's the heart. The left, it's normal for us, people like us, the little ones at the bottom of society, it's the left. And after 5 years of the administration Hollande, they were totally against. So it's the idea that the left has abandoned us. They don't care about what's really important for us, social and economic everyday problems. So if it's a responsibility of the left, and maybe they're going to think about that now, but there's something there to do to change their image.
So the question of, if I understand, how the Democrats can move forward from the current position they find themselves in. So I'm not sure how, well, a well-orchestrated media campaign can be done and has been done to convince people that the root of their problems is immigrants, all right? And this is quite far from the truth. These 12 million immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the United States, keep our so many of our food production industries going, the construction industry, as I mentioned. They pay hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, gasoline taxes, even if they're paid in cash. But many of them are paid legitimately through payrolls because they used a made-up identity number, a social security number, or one that was used for somebody who's passed away. And through that, they pay a lot of money in payroll taxes. So it's very odd, ironic, and strange that Donald Trump has managed to convince so many people that the reason you're suffering economically is because immigrants have come and taken your jobs away. They want to harm you. They want to take things from you. They're parasites, right? When in fact, we are the regular Americans are the parasites, right? We're using this system of labor and exploiting it. And it's very difficult to get policies that would help them in terms of their working conditions, the dangers that they face, working in the dairy industry and in the meat processing industries, and do something about their pay, because in terms of the law, they don't have any status, right? To help them, you'd have to acknowledge them or give them some kind of legal status. So I think the Democrats need to work very hard on reversing that message and letting people see what the reality is. Part of me almost hopes, in a strange way, it's, you know, these deportations are going to cause a lot of suffering and a lot of family separation. But part of me hopes that it's going to reveal to people what the impact is in terms of what they pay for food. Those food prices are subsidized by their labor, right? So we've been getting away with cheap food prices for a long time, and that might come to an end. Now, there's also the problem of, you know, the larger economic issues. There's the shift from a production economy to a service economy to now a knowledge-based economy. And economically, that benefits people with high educations and high technical skills. And so people involved in production economy have felt left behind because that's all become globalized, and the labor shifts to the places where labor is cheapest. So, you know, and Democrats have stayed with knowledge workers and because that's where the money is, and money's very important in politics. I think that to be effective, they need to move away from that addiction to money from tech moguls and other wealthy individuals in the economy, and move back toward emphasizing the importance of labor unions and workers' rights for people in the production economy. I would never have thought that laborers and production workers would have gone over to the Republican Party at this point in time. That's the party that's worked very hard to impoverish them in many ways. So I think they can put a credible case together. I'm not optimistic about the control of money or the influence of money in American politics. When we've tried to legislate that, the courts have gone the other way. with some of the legal decisions that they've made. But I think that's where they need to go. And I think they've got 2 years to get themselves back together, regain control of the House, and then we'll see where they go.
So, I guess one way to phrase your question is, it's like, you've seen what's happening in America. Like, what can we do to not have it happen here? But I think, I think in some sense it's too late. In that, that I think that there is already that this is not just an American problem. This misinformation, rumors everywhere. So, wherever I talk to a foreign audience, I would tell these stories about, rumors in America, and they say, "Oh, that's nothing." Let me tell you this story about what we have there, but it wasn't just these kind of these rumors; they're politically charged rumors as well. So think about the case of Brexit, right? I think that this is one where there were a lot of misinformation and rumors about, kind of what was going on there. And I think that drove a lot of the political decisions, a lot of the rhetoric. And so I think, so on the one hand, I would say, that you're halfway there, right? And so, but I do think that there are some differences between sort of the American culture and European culture, that there's a lot of the kind of the distrust of institutions runs very deep in American politics. Sort of thinking about going back to sort of the founders, so that a lot of what the US was built on was a distrust of having a centralized institution there. This is a theme that comes up again and again. So I guess if you want to look at it as the glass half full, to say, well, you have a deeper reservoir of political culture to draw on. But if you want to look at it as the glass half empty, it's like, well, people are people, and everywhere people are going to believe crazy things. And I think one important thing is to think about that. It's when I talk, I study political behavior and more on the reception side, but kind of in your kind of thing. But it doesn't mean I don't think the producer side isn't important. In fact, I think it's critical. And I think that we are where we are today in the US because, as I said, politicians have basically abandoned the norms that we thought governed their behavior there. So I think, that I want to leave time for questions. So rather than giving everyone a question, I think one thing I would say is, like, we're all talking about the same thing, is that if you want to have responsible politics, you need to have responsible politicians. So one line I often use when I talk about politics to my audience is saying, that most of the people, most of the time, don't care about politics. I've used this line the other day when I gave a talk here. And you need to recognize that. So I always say to my audience, you're weird, right? You're unusual, right? You're here because you care about politics, right? You've been sitting for an hour and 45 minutes. We're still going because you care about politics, that you think about politics. And so when you think about how ordinary people think about the world, just think about that this is more of a casual sideshow. So we shouldn't blame the people, right, for believing these things. We should blame the politicians for pushing these stories. And so I think if we're going to think about a solution, it really does need to come from the top. Or see Larry Bartels, sort of thinking about, right, that democracy rots from the top, but that it's been rotting pretty well, right? And so we need a new fish head, I guess, and sort of like to bring that together there. So I think that's a common theme in everything that we're talking about, is that it's very easy to blame the people, but we really should be blaming the politicians. But that's a harder solution, right? Thinking about what to do. And so a lot of the stories I talk about of how can we stem the flow of misinformation, it's in a world in which politicians are behaving badly. Here's little things we can do to tweak at the end. But if we really want to change things, we need to change the politicians.